good evening. It's good to be with you. I came directly from class, so I just finished a 3-hour lecture on determinism and free will. So do you want to do that instead? Because then you can scrap over various things like Calvinism and this sort of thing. I've made it. I'm glad to be here. You probably ought to know something about me. I teach philosophy, and I do philosophy for fun, not just for a living. It's something you sort of catch as a somewhat analogous to a disease that people have called philosophy, which means you're asking questions that no one seems to have the answer to. And any time you've got one of those, you'll eventually work your way to the philosophy department, because that's where they deal with questions no one knows the answer to, or even can figure out how you might supply an answer. But it's just a pleasure to try and figure out some of those answers. So hopefully I'm going to talk to you about that tonight. I'm also a Christian, obviously, and I teach in the seminary. I came to faith when I was 10 years old, but I think me and Augustine might compete in heaven for the slowest sanctification of all time. We'll see who actually wins. But both of us had a great deal of trouble unshackling ourselves from the former things. And so it took me a very long time. I did everything late. I'm a late bloomer. Got married just before I was 30. I didn't start my undergraduate program until I was 34, had 2 children. I grew up in England, and my entire family became Christians when I was young. But I had no interest in academics at all, just none at all. But I wanted to serve the Lord, and I knew the Lord had called me to do a ministry of an evangelistic type. So when I was very young, I became a Christian at 10, and instantly wanted to tell my friends about Jesus. And it became the central component of my life, and also what annoyed everyone the most was the fact that I just would not stop. And so I was somewhat ridiculed for it. I went to boarding school from the age of 7, so they couldn't escape me, but I couldn't escape them either. So there was somewhat, it sort of put me at odds with some of my friends. But I just was passionate about the gospel. I wanted them to know. And amazingly, the Lord allowed that 2 of my friends heard the gospel, believed, and became Christians. So I had this sort of very strange discipleship group that I ran in the boiler room of my boarding school with all the heating paraphernalia. So once I left school, I went on to work for British Youth for Christ, and as an itinerant evangelist. So I worked in music ministry, so if you can imagine such a thing, I had really long hair and good-sized sideburns, and played in bands, and did lots of preaching and touring all over the UK and Europe as well, trying to spread the gospel to teenagers. And I stayed in that kind of ministry for, I guess it would have been 12 years in various ways. And then during a visit to the US where I met my wife, I gradually became aware of the lack of my formal knowledge, if you like, education. And my wife was the real problem. She knew her stuff, and I was embarrassed. The fact that I just had not got a good knowledge of the Bible. I remember sitting in a tea room in Bath, and you know what that looked like. Hello, how are you? All that sort of thing. So it's very, very English in Bath, England. And I remember her telling me the Old Testament, just from memory. She just could tell all the stories and tell me about which king came when and which prophet said what. And I was just blown away. But I also knew I needed to get an education. And so I started to pursue some sort of part-time studies in Oxford, where we eventually lived, and just became addicted to academics. And knew that philosophy was really where I wanted to aim to, but I needed it to be theological and Christian, deeply so. So I ended up going to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and I got my undergrad there in philosophical theology and apologetics. And then after that, I continued. I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, and got my master's in philosophy of religion. And then I took a couple of years to serve in a church in Maryland, just outside DC, and was the youth and student pastor in a large Presbyterian church. So I did that for a couple of years, but knew I needed to complete my studies and go on to teach. And the reason I wanted to teach is because I realized, having done my undergrad, especially in the field that I did, after I'd done my ministry, just how you need the education to do the ministry as well. So when I got my PhD, I was just praying to the Lord, you know, if you have a spot for me right here in Wake Forest in Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, I'd be very happy to take it. He was very gracious to me. And so in the process of getting my PhD, I was offered a position teaching there, and that's where I teach. So Southeastern has a sort of dual commitment that they manage to maintain, which is almost impossible to do, because one side usually wins out, and then you have nothing at the other side. But they will not give up doing both. Partly because if you want to be a missionary, you've got to have theologians. Missionaries need content, and the only content you get is when someone's done the hard graft of the theology. Missions and evangelism and those sorts of ministries last 20 minutes if you've only got one sermon. So building a kind of intellectual foundation for long-term or lifelong ministry is what we do at Southeast. But it's great to be with you. I'm going to be talking about the imagination. I need my notes for that. And hopefully there'll be a little bit of interaction, but no visuals. And why not? Well, because it's a topic is imagination, so I'm going to make you do it yourself. Okay, so that's how this works. Has anyone got any questions for me about what I've just said?
When you were 10 years old, you said you came to faith at 10 years old.
Yeah.
But before that, like, what was your background? Like, did you go to church or anything like that?
Yeah, well, my parents were sort of Church of England types, in that church was attended at least 3 times a year. And that would be about it. That's all that was necessary. And I think we would have regarded ourselves as Christians by birth. And that's true of nations that have a national or state church. Often people are regarded as just being Christians because you're born in a Christian country. So I think we would have assumed that. It was only when my mother encountered a friend who she asked to look after the goats. We had goats, we had some homestead type thing going on there. And this friend said to her, "You're not a Christian," which sent my mother nuts. Who was she to say that she wasn't a Christian? And then she realized that her friend was right. And at that point, she became one. She went to the Lord and said, I'm sorry, I've always just assumed I was good enough, but I'm not. Clearly, I need to receive your favor by other means, not by my works, but by the works of Christ as he has worked to redeem me. So that's what sparked revival in my house. First me, actually. I was the next to fall when I fell off my bike. Winded, so I was lying there going, you know how you do. Those of you who play rugby, not that other thing you play, sort of fake rugby. But yeah, I was sort of winded, and my mother lay beside me, and I've always said I think she thought I might die, so I wanted to make sure I went to the right place. But she said, "Would you like to become a Christian quickly before you go?" I said yes, and so I prayed something very profound, apparently, which was, you know, Jesus, come into my life and change me and forgive me of my sins. So I was, and nothing happened, but as I say, the effects later were that I became passionate about sharing this gospel with others. I considered other people could tell I'd become a Christian. I thought, okay, well, I'm a different person. Something has changed in me. All sorts of things I had to do to rectify previous wrongs and that sort of thing. But yes, it was. And then my sister became a Christian, and then eventually my dad, and in fact my grandparents all became Christians. So. All right, so what I want to do this evening is I want to talk about the imagination, and it's important for apologetics and also for the Christian life. But it's important we also know what it is. There is lots of study on the imagination, and I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to use some philosophy tonight, but I've tried to make it as practical as possible, and at least as interesting for non-philosophers as possible. So I won't get into the weeds too much. I'm just going to talk about the imagination. And hopefully by the end of the evening you can see a good role for the imagination, and also curtail it from perhaps some potential roles that you might have used it for, but you might reconsider using it that way. Well, I'm going to talk about something called the imagination, but what on earth is it? In fact, why not keep you awake by asking you, what do you think it is? What do you think the imagination is? What's the imagination? You've got one, some of you might not. Apparently a very small percentage of people cannot, by closing their eyes and thinking of it, think of an apple. So if you can't do that, you lack a certain power, but most people can. So close your eyes, think of an apple. Is it good? Has it got details? Who is not able to think of an apple? Okay, all of you have got some imagination, but you can check just by producing image. So what is this thing that we're talking about? What's the topic on tonight? You can tell me and then I'll talk about it. What's imagination? What is it? It's weird, isn't it? But what is it?
Thoughts, like it's your made up thought.
Yeah, something made up. It's definitely, you can sort of make something. It's something you can make. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Does it always come from memories that you've seen?
Yeah, well, maybe.
Okay.
That's a good question about the imagination, isn't it? Does it always come from memories? I mean, presumably you can create something, but do you mean like the materials you use have to come from memories or something?
Yeah, like the apple. I've seen an apple. So.
Yes, right. You're reconstructing something you've seen before from memories or previous perceptions. Good. Okay. Yes, and that's an important feature of it too. You can certainly use it that way. What else would you say about the imagination? It's a word association game. Imagination. Go.
Creativity.
Creativity. Yeah. I mean, it seems to be one of those components of our mental faculties that's most deployed for creativity, and that's why people who have incredibly powerful imaginations often go on to use it professionally. Like who might use the imagination to make money? Graphic designer, right? What writers, yeah. If you write fiction, if you have a powerful imagination, you can operate at a sort of higher level of creativity just because you can bring into being certain things that other people can't even come up with. Right? And if you're too imaginative, your reader encounters imaginative resistance, which is a feature of reading a book when you think, yeah, I'm done here, I can't follow the book, I can't imagine what the author's trying to tell me, and therefore I'm not going on any further. So this is imaginative resistance. It's a sort of feature of being a fiction reader. So some people's imaginations are sort of off track to their readers. They sort of have a minority of people who will follow them, but less than they might otherwise have. So popular fiction is just easy to imagine, but sometimes imagination is required of the reader that's a little bit more than they've got. So what else would you say about it? What else?
You can choose to think of things.
Oh yeah, now that's a really important feature of the imagination, isn't it? It seems like you can choose to do it or not, which is very different to what else which is similar to it but different in that way.
Observation.
Yeah, right. You perceive things, you don't get a choice about what you're seeing. In order to make it different, you have to use your imagination. You can do both, can't you? You can see a group of people and imagine one extra, or imagine an apple, a large one, sitting in one of the chairs. You can do what you like, your imagination and your perception. But they're two distinct powers for that reason, aren't they? Good, good. Anyone? One more? Yes.
It tends to play on the perceptions that you actually have. Like you can see things in your mind, you can hear things in your mind, but you know, there are some things that you can't really come up with. Like you can't come up with new colors, you can't come up with new tastes.
Okay, that's good. So maybe you're constrained to some degree by what you've previously experienced. And it may be possible to come up with some really difficult things to imagine, but even those are constrained. Like think of shapes. So you can just take a bunch of shapes and make something completely new in your mind that's never been made before, but you will have encountered those shapes before, like circles or squares or something like that. Yeah, maybe the idea that you can't conceive of another color. That's very interesting. Yeah, so it maybe has some kind of constraints to it to some degree. Can't imagine just anything. Square circles perhaps are impossible to imagine. That sort of here are three sort of examples or cases, and that's what we're going to sort of refer to these throughout the evening to give you some idea of how I'm going to use it, of seeing with the mind's eye. So one of the things you want to think of the imagination is it's a visual thing. It's in the title, imagination. Image is in the title. So predominantly, I'm talking about the images that you can pull up in your mind's eye. So they don't require your actual eye to see them. So you can close your actual eyes and not be perceiving anything through them, but still perceive an image or imagine an image, because you're not really perceiving it. It's not using the faculty of your eye, but you can analogously think of your mind's eye producing an image that you can examine in your mind without using your perceptual faculties. So here are three sort of examples of using the imagination. So these are examples from my own life. I imagine a tree in a yard with a lake in the background. I imagine my son bringing me freshly caught fish. I can bring to mind my eye a series of images, and they are all of my son and the fish. Okay. Second one. I imagine a giant wasp buzzing around towards a skyscraper in a downtown. It attacks the building, smashing windows. The sky darkens and a swarm of giant yellow jackets descends on the city, sending everyone running for the cover. So that's the second one. You can see why I do not, I'm not an author of fiction. I imagine, in the last one, this one is a little bit different. I imagine being in a large amphitheater towards the top of the stands. I imagine that the whole arena is filled with people writhing in pain, and suddenly all their pain appears in my body. I run from the arena, falling underneath some trees some distance away. The pain dissipates, the sun warms me, and a voice says, it's going to be okay. So these are sort of 3 examples of the use of the imagination, but they're all different in varying respects. But I want to sort of talk about some commonalities and some differences about these 3 cases. So the first one is of my son with his fish by the lake. The next one is the wasp attacking the building, and the last one is me in an amphitheater or a stadium, and all the people in the stadium are in agony, and all the pain comes to me, and I run, and the pain goes, and then I hear a voice saying it's going to be okay. So those are the 3 scenarios, and they're all examples of the use of the imagination. They happen to be my use of the imagination. So the first thing to notice is that emotions are very commonly connected with the imagination. So when you use the imagination, it seems that to some degree, it's always going to cause an emotion. That's not necessarily the case. You could just turn the emotions off and just use the imagination. But it is interesting that they're generally connected with the imagination. There's a strong connection with emotions and the imaginations. In fact, you might think about imaginations being something you can use to cause emotions. So you can bring about emotions by using your imagination. So that's an interesting connection. And it's not necessarily true at all times you use the imagination, but it at least seems to be a common feature amongst many instances of use of imagination. The second thing I want you to notice is that imagination is rather analogous to a sentence. What do I mean by that? Well, imagination represents to your mind something else. So sentences do that. Sentences represent propositions, or the meaning of a sentence. So think about the meaning of the sentence, the snow is white. You can imagine the snow being white. You can also think about the sentence, the snow is white. And it's really acting to represent something. What is it acting to represent? Well, the meaning of the sentence, the snow is white. If you say, well, the meaning of the sentence just is the sentence, you have to deal with the problem that Schnee ist weiß is also representing the same meaning, but it's a different sentence. So if the meaning is the sentence, it can't be the case that another sentence that's different is representing the same meaning. But it seems like those 2 things, Schnee ist weiß and snow is white, represent the same meaning. So meaning isn't the same as a sentence, nor is an image the same as the thing it's depicting. So you can think about paintings representing or depicting something in reality. If I painted a picture of you, it would not depict you because I can't paint, but if someone depicted you in a painting, it would have a kind of connection to you. It would represent you in some form or way. So that's really important too. Images that you can bring to mind are ways in which you can represent things. And that's true of sentences, right? Who, when you think, are conscious that you are actually thinking in your native tongue? Right? I'm very conscious of it. Some of you don't do any thinking, so it's fine. I'm just kidding. Some of you don't think in sentences, or you haven't consciously thought about thinking in sentences. But perhaps next time you're just sitting there. It's very apparent when you are thinking about how you'll respond to somebody. Maybe someone said something you didn't like and you need to go talk to them. You're often much more conscious of using sentences. So sentences can be used in the mind to represent thoughts, okay? And in the same way, I would say images are similar. The images that you bring to mind in your mind's eye, the imagination, are those things that represent something, right? In the case of my son, it's representing a memory, okay? I'm bringing to mind things that I have perceived, and I'm reconstructing them in my mind's eye. I'm selecting and arranging things so that they look like the thing that I saw when I saw my son catching a fish, which is fairly regularly. So I've got lots of memories. So the image that I have is a compilation, probably, of all sorts of things that I've seen in my before. Same with imagining the giant wasps. I'm telling my mind, or my own mind's eye, to construct images that represent these sorts of ideas. So that's another sort of feature of this. And the other thing you want to notice about these things is they are intentional actions. So the first 2 are really obvious. I can do this and I act. So I have to do it. It's an action. So I'm intending to bring about an image and I go ahead and perform an action in my mind. Now, mental actions are weird, but it will make you think twice about thinking that going to class, you aren't really doing anything. You need to go out and do something. No, you're doing something. It's mental hard work, and that's stuff that you do up here. Someone says, you want to go to the gym? You say, I'm already I've got this massive, great big proposition. I don't even know what a large weight is. I don't go to the gym. But it's a big one with lots of the things on the end of it. I'm doing with this with it.
And you could just say 275.
275, that's what I'm lifting.
You can bench 275.
I'm
that's what my
benching a
brother
275 proposition right now. And so you're doing mental work, and this is another one of those mental activities. It means that it's an action is something you can deliberate over and choose whether or not to do it, which is an excellent comment from the back there I heard earlier. So you can select things, arrange things according to your will. So you're doing work, you're performing an intentional action. And usually the action is done so you can get something. So I imagine my son catching a fish just for pleasure of memory of a wonderful thing for my son, something like that. I have an aim, and so I can do it, and I can achieve it by doing this action. The last one, though, is weird because that's a dream. So I dreamt being in that amphitheater and experiencing all the pain of the people in it. And so you might say, well, that's a time where your imagination, you don't act at all. It just happens, right? Surely dreaming is an instance of using your mind's eye. You're not perceiving this stuff, at least I'm really hopeful. Most of my dreams will not be good to be perceiving those things occurring. Although sometimes, especially when I'm flying, in my dream, does anyone fly in their dream? Dream flyers? It's the most wonderful thing in the world. And it hasn't happened to me for years. I keep hoping, be a flying knight. Anyway, for those things, maybe that would be cool if you could perceive that. But there are some things you wouldn't want to occur. But nonetheless, I would say that even dreaming is an activity of the mind. And the reason I think this is, there's a few reasons. The first one is that in a dream you're still able to act rationally. Like even if you're not conscious of it being a dream, you are rationally trying to escape the monster, or trying to, for some people, this is occasionally a dream that people have apparently, is trying to find clothes to wear when you find yourself in a public place wearing none. That's apparently a common enough dream. So those things are rational things to do, the finding of the clothes, and the attempting to fly when able. Those are all rational things to do. You can kind of explain what your actions are in a dream by thinking about things you might want to achieve, like escaping or whatever it might be. So that gives us a sign that this dream isn't just random, it's something reasonable is going on. And also dreams have design features. You can sort of spot stories almost, right? Sometimes they're very heavily laden with stories. There's an enemy and you have to go and beat them or something like that. Chappers is my books of things. There are some times where you have to beat evil in your dream. And so they have design features. They have a kind of narrative form. Often they move the emotions like you do in a movie. It's like someone has designed it. Well, a design feature indicates a designer, and that entails somehow that you are responsible for designing the dream, even though you're not phenomenologically aware of doing so. You're not thinking, well, there are two people. One is like a movie audience, and the other is the author of the book. Even though you're not conscious of that, it's quite possible, at least I would say highly plausible, that is the best way to see dreaming. You actually are the agent in control and the receiver. You're both the author and the reader of a novel, or the screenwriter, director, and the movie theatre audience. You receive it and you do it. But there's lots of actions that are like that, like you can hit yourself. That's an action you perform and you also receive the action, right? I'm the patient and the agent of my hitting myself, and speaking to yourself too, which is slightly better thing to do. It's something you can do to yourself. So there's lots of things you can do yourself, but in some cases you're not aware of one component, right? The person doing. You're not aware of yourself doing an action, even though you are performing one. One example is self-deception. Right? You might believe that P is standing for any proposition, but deceive yourself that it's not true. So if that's possible, then it's plausible to see yourself as someone who is doing something, even though you might not be aware of it. So I tend to think that even dreaming is an action under the control of you. You just are more aware of receiving the action than you are of performing it. And that makes sense too. It's much more vivid to be watching a movie than make it, right? Being in the movie and watching it, it's gonna take all your visual attention, and if you're asleep, you've got a lot of attention going on, so what little of it there is all attended to the action in the movie that you think you're starring in, but not to the writing of it. Right? You don't notice yourself controlling the action. So that's one way to see a dream in the context of the imagination. We pointed out that it's not the same as perception, because perception, you do not have any choice about what you see when you attend to it, but in imagination you do. And of course, the imagination, finally, I would say perhaps the imagination could be hijacked. If it's something that an agent performs, it's quite possible for some powerful agent to hijack it and use it to create something else. Can you think of an example of that occurring?
Intrusive thoughts.
Intrusive thoughts, like another agent is doing that, or you are?
No, in the sense of like your brain sometimes creates things that you don't want to happen.
Oh, that's true. What do you do when that happens? I need help.
Medically, you're actually supposed to just ignore them and pretend that they're not there.
Okay, that's what I do. That's
Yeah.
medically, that's science, that's proper
Yeah.
science. Okay, I'm on the right track. Yes, good. And that's true. Like your memory pops up, and if you've got memories where you did something really embarrassing, every now and again it occurs to you that one day you did that, and you can always tell when I'm having one because I'm slightly stupid. And my stomach knots. Oh, why did I do that? And then you just have to get rid of it. Shove it. Okay, that's good. Yeah, I meant something like God could hijack it, right? So I'm not sure if this is true. It just occurs to me that visions could be explained by the imagination. God produces a perception. It could also be that he hijacks your perceptual faculties. It doesn't tell us either way, but it could be that he overrules your control over your imagination and produces visions. It could also be more like hallucination, which is a problem with the actual perceptual faculties. He could also hijack those. But either way, there is if it's something an agent can do, it seems that it could be hijacked by a more powerful agent who has access to your mind, which would be God. So that's the sort of description of the imagination, gets you into the idea. And now I want to talk a little bit about apologetics. Now that is what interests you, because I hear that this is called ratio Christi, which seems to indicate apologetics is an important thing. Just guessing, is that right? Yes. Okay, good. So I want to talk about the imagination and apologetics because it's somewhat of a controversial issue amongst professionals and all that sort of thing. But it's important that we understand what we use the imagination for, because we can fall into some slightly, I think, dubious conclusions about the imagination. So the question is, for the apologetic task that we have, is whether the imagination can help us make the rational case, the ratio case for Christ, right? Does it aid in supporting the belief that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, for example, or that God exists? That's the question. And there are two views. One view says that, yes, the imagination is like a source of knowledge, like memory or perception or introspection or all these other ways we get to know the world. Imagination does that too. This view has its application in sort of thinking about how literature can help. Narratives can help support the belief that Jesus Christ died on the cross, even if they're fictional. So fiction could be used as a kind of additional teaching method to help someone come to new knowledge, right, about what has occurred. The other view is, no, it can't. The imagination does not have any epistemic traction. It can't perform the same kind of role as evidence of testimony, for example, that you would use to support the belief that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. John said it, John sincerely believes it, John knows what he's talking about, and John says Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And ordinarily, under those circumstances, you've got evidence enough to believe that that Jesus Christ rose from the dead based on eyewitness testimony. That's the kind of evidence we use, isn't it? Does it have its role in there? Some say no, it does not support the belief, and some say yes. So I'm going to take the negative tack, and you can see what you think of my case. So my case is no. Imagination is very, very powerful, but it cannot support a belief in any evidential way. Like, it doesn't raise the probability of it being true to any degree. It just doesn't serve that role. So that's my view. There are two views, so you can take the opposite view, but here's my case for my sort of claim here. So the first reason that I think that the imagination can't serve as evidence for a belief, i.e. Evidence would support it to the degree that it makes it more likely that it's true than not, or even play a role in a case. It can't be one strand of a case. It wouldn't add any evidential value to your case. So my first reason is that because it's a representation of something, it can't serve as evidence. And this is the basic idea. Take the sentence, Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now, I might have all sorts of reasons, I've just given you one from John's Gospel, for believing that it's true. But if I said, and also the sentence counts to raise the probability of its being true, just look at the sentence, I'll write it on the board, you can look at the sentence, Jesus Christ rose from the dead, I could say it, Jesus Christ rose from the dead, can you hear the sentence? This represents the proposition that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I couldn't make a case by including that, right? Just look at the sentence. That wouldn't add any evidential weight for the belief that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and hence it doesn't add any evidence to a belief. It can't do that because it just represents something. Another thing you might say is that sometimes the imagination could be used to discover something true about you. For example, what if you go to a house and you are in the rental market or you want to buy, and you see the house and you sit down and you think, I'm just going to imagine having coffee here on a Sunday morning before church and see if I like it. And you discover that you do. Would you say, well, my imagination's helped me discover my preferences? Well, there's lots of beliefs we have that don't require any evidence, right? And one of them is preferences. You know your preferences by just examining what you like and what you don't like, but you don't have any reasons for them. You wouldn't. If someone said, well, I don't believe you, just defend yourself. You like this flavor ice cream, or you want to live in this house, I don't believe you. You have to explain why you're justified in your belief that you like that ice cream, or you want to live in this house. They're not the kinds of things you could say, well, I just do, right? That's your only answer, because there isn't reasons for doing so. You can try to prove that you do, like, well, I'll buy the house, and then you believe me. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for some kind of evidence to think it's true that you like it. So you can't. So the imagination doesn't play any role there. Some people have said that there's all sorts of things you can do with the imagination that are like computer simulation. So, for example, there's a famous one by Kathleen Stock who says, what if I see my dress and I think, what would that look like on my friend? So I just imagine the dress on my friend, and that will give me justification for thinking it will fit. But of course that one just sneakily slips in the fact that she knows what her friend looks like and she knows what the dress looks like. So she's not basing the imagination on any new, or the imagination doesn't produce anything new, it just represents things she already knows, right? So it's again just used to represent things as they are, or things as they are not, as you do when you're writing work of fiction. There are lots of others, like Timothy Williamson, a famous Oxford philosopher, says, what if you want to cross a stream and you can see 3 places you can put your feet, you could imagine yourself doing it, and then you would know whether you can cross or not. It's just not true. It comes from the imagination. It comes from your beliefs about yourself and how far away the stones are. You're just representing yourself running across the stream. You aren't finding out anything new about the stream. So I don't think it works as a kind of simulation. But lots of people say it works to get moral beliefs. Like the imagination is the sort of source or the way in which you can gain moral knowledge. So some people say the best way to learn morality is read fiction, because you'll be able to learn morality. Now, I grant you that fiction gives you a great opportunity to morally reflect on the world, what's right and what's wrong, and to use kind of intuitions to figure out what you think. And you should do that. Right? You should read fiction critically, always asking, is this morally sound? Why would I believe this? Don't be moved by the story and just say, well, that means all sorts of things are justified because it feels like it. No, you should ask yourself whether these things are right or not. But lots of people do say the imagination plays a role in this. Famously, John Rawls, a political philosopher, says that you can gain justification for the belief that people have rights to property from other people, for example. The right to use a coercive state to take some property from one person and give it to someone else. So you can develop a belief that some people have rights from imagining what it's like to be in the position where you're about to enter the world and you don't know at what position you'll be. You could be poor or really wealthy. So you can imagine that, and imagining that gives you access to what you want the world to be like. Well, most people, when they see that, they say, well, I could end up with absolutely nothing. So you can do anything you like to this state. You can can make the state do whatever you please in order to make sure that you do not end up at the bottom. You could be rich, but you don't want to take that chance. So most people, when they do this imaginary experiment, will say, I would prefer that you redistribute wealth. In other words, you use a coercive state to take from some people who've produced and give it to some people who haven't. So that's a justification for redistribution of wealth. Now, whatever you think of the claim that you should redistribute wealth, this is not my point. My point is, the argument relies on the imagination to get the conclusion. But the problem you can see with that is, does it really? Does it get the conclusion? It gets you your preference. It's a pragmatic argument, right? What would I do? But it doesn't tell you whether there really is a right that is objectively true of the world. Right? It gives you no reason to think there is a right to take other people's possessions and appropriate them to yourself. Now, it may be true that that's what ought to happen, but this doesn't give you any reason to think that that's true of the world. In other words, it doesn't give you a moral principle. Why? Because you've imagined, and all you've got from the results of the imagination is that you would prefer to have a world that includes a redistribution policy that would make sure that you had healthcare or whatever it might be. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't, I'm just saying that the argument doesn't get you there. There's another incident. Some people say that David learns something from Nathan, and Nathan tells him a story. Do you remember this? David is king, and up until the point he's king, he's a great guy, but as soon as he becomes king, as it goes with the territory of being king, is that you become one who, Samuel says, will take your sons, take your daughters, make war, and plunder your possessions. That's what kings do. You can have one if you want, Israel, that's what Samuel says. The Lord has told him to say this, so it's divinely sanctioned sentences. But they will take all your possessions, plunder your children, and make war. So David does what every king does. He just is repentant. There's this big distinction between him and many of the other kings. But during that time, he violates two very strong divine commands. One is to not take another person's wife, and he goes, and he's king, so he can take what he wants, right? That's what the Lord says. If you get a king, they can take whatever they please. You might be surprised to hear that from an Englishman. He's supposed to be for the king. No, man, this is going on YouTube. I'm really sorry to discover this way, Charles, but I don't think you have the right to rule over anybody. You can look at John Locke's Second Treatise of Government for good reasons, all right, and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, Morocco. But you get the point, right? There's the king can take anything, and so David takes it. It is a rotten thing to do. Takes his neighbor's wife. And he then has to get rid of the neighbor's wife's husband, and he murders him, right? Has him killed in battle. This is just, it's not just, oh, well, he's a king, naughty, naughty. No, this is a wickedly obscene thing to do. And so the prophet Nathan approaches him and tells him a story of a rich man who has plenty of lamb and sheep, but he, in order to feed a guest, takes the poor man's lamb. And this lamb is so precious to that man. He has looked after this lamb his whole life. And he tells him this really powerful story. And David is incensed. He says, bring me that man, and we will have justice. We will punish that man, that rich man, for taking the poor man's lamb. And Nathan says, that man is you. And at that point, David gets it. He realizes that his crime is abhorrent and is just like the thing that he has seen or imagined being done to this neighbor's possessions. It's taken by the rich man to feed his guests without having to touch his flock. It reminds you of many other characters in the New Testament who were always more fascinated with their lambs than they were with the children of Israel. Nonetheless, this is supposed to be sort of like imagination gets David to believe something and therefore justifies his belief. The only thing I'd say is, again, you have to see that the imagination is not doing anything. It's representing the story, and it is, displaying the story in the mind's eye, and that affects David's emotions, because the emotions that David has is of grief. This breaks him, and he wants to break down in grief. He regrets doing it, and he hadn't regretted it up until that point. And even if he learns something from hearing the story, he doesn't learn the fact of it until Nathan tells him, not in the story, but out loud to David as Nathan, not in storytelling mode, which is, that man is you. So even if you think the analogy is, you know, it's like a court case, and analogical reasoning, anyone trained to be a lawyer knows you're going to have to make analogies, right? You have to call on precedents in previous cases, and you'll say it's like this, like that. And that's why you should, make the judgment I think you should make. The same happens here, but the evidence for it being an analog is from Nathan, not from the story itself. So even if you think that it's not merely representative of some story, and it's the story that's doing the work, the story writer doesn't do the work, it is Nathan who does it. So, what does happen when you use the imagination? Well, if it's not evidence, it must be something else. And this is where I think the imagination can be used in apologetics. Apologetics is not merely rational persuasion. So it is rational to believe in Jesus Christ, and in order to make a good case for Jesus Christ, you do need to employ reason. But that's not the only way you can persuade someone, okay? We're not merely rational, we are also affective. So the affections and the emotions are vital for a persuasive case. And in some case, you will find that that's where the resistance lies. You don't find it in the evidential package you put together. They aren't resistant to that, but they are resistant to it for some other reasons. It's one of the reasons people abandon apologetics, because they say, well, it doesn't work. My friend has heard all the arguments and they think they're very good, but they still hate God. So reason doesn't work at all, so we should abandon it. That's a faulty way to go. It's explained by thinking that people aren't only committed to their beliefs because of the reasons they have for them, they're also committed to them because they love them, and resistant because they hate them. And that makes sense, right? In fact, think of the New Testament, the Gospels. Who has had all the evidence they should ever need to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but still don't believe it? Can you think of some people?
Pharisees.
Pharisees, right? So they are deeply hostile to Jesus Christ, and when they keep asking for more signs, Jesus responds by saying, you've had enough. Essentially, you're going to have the sign of Jonah, which is the worst possible sign to get. The sign of Jonah is you've seen all the evidence you're going to get, and now I'm going to warn you. That's what prophets did, and no less Jonah. You are going to watch people repent and come and believe in the Messiah, even though you would think that they should remain outside. They're not worthy of having a Messiah, and yet Jesus will save them. So this is a sign of judgment that you'll receive. They've had enough evidence, yet they resist for other reasons, hostility of hatred. More innocent versions might be, you know, I've heard what you say, and I believe in Jesus. I believe Jesus is who he says he is, and your arguments are very good, and I'm really, you know, there's some good things about this, but I just have been through too many experiences which make me think I'm scared of this, and I know what happened before when I went to church, and it was too much. Those are psychological in nature. They're not necessarily rational in nature. So you are not committed to your beliefs purely because you have good reasons to think they're true. You're also committed to them because you have deep affection for them. Think of your belief that 2 + 2 = 4. Could that be false? I know there's a lot of people who try to make this false, so don't do some complicated math, because it's obviously true, right? I've got taken a philosophy of math class and this. Okay, so 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, let's say it's possibly false. I'll give you that. So maybe we're 99%. 99% sure. How sure are you that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? Now, when I say sure, just think of the reasons you have for thinking it's true. Not how committed you are, but how sure are you that you have enough evidence? Like, what evidentially? It's possibly false. Let's say that's true of being 2 + 2 = 4. But 2 + 2 = 4 is you're 99%. You're up at the top. But Jesus Christ rose from the dead? Or let me say, Battle of Hastings was 1066. Similar kind of belief. I mean, less important. But they're history beliefs, right? How absolutely certain are your arguments for Jesus Christ rose from the dead compared to 2 + 2 = 4? Probably less, right? Now, it doesn't mean you're less convicted about it, because those are two distinct things. But if you were in Room 101 in George Orwell's novel, and you were told to say that 2 + 2 = 5, would you do it? I would. I don't care about 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 5. 5, sure. I wouldn't care. Now make me try and give up Jesus Christ rose from the dead. See where you get to. I would hope that I would die on it. And why? Because I have more conviction about my belief that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. That's subjective, okay? So these two things come apart. I am more rational in believing that 2 + 2 = 4. It's super rational to believe that. Or I could think of it like a necessary truth, like the law of non-contradiction. A proposition can't be true and false, something like that. Something that's so impossible to refute. It takes, you can't do it. Something is super sure. I wouldn't care about that belief. But the one that I only have historical evidence for in the Bible, I think I want to keep that one, no matter what you do to me. Now that tells you that your psychological commitment to beliefs isn't just about evidence. Okay? By the way, if you think that sort of robs you of certainty of your belief, you shouldn't think so. The degree of certainty can match the degree to which you can get evidence for a belief. And historical beliefs just don't get math belief certainty, right? They get historical belief certainty, which, if you read the Gospels and look for evidence for their truth, is really, really good. Right? You can put them up there at 90%. They're as high as historical beliefs can go, which means you can just be certain about them. Okay? They're very good, shored up beliefs. But you shouldn't think that that's the whole story. I'm telling you this to try and illustrate that your mind isn't just a rational computer that sort of computes logic. It's also filled with affections. And this will change the way you feel about the beliefs you have. It will change the way you resist beliefs you know are rational. It will affect you in your life when you doubt something. Oftentimes Christians have doubt. It's got nothing to do with lowering the likelihood of its truth. You think, I still believe it's true, I just don't feel the same way about it. If you're a PK, pastor's kid, you will probably know what this experience is like. You grew up, and the one thing you knew about was loving Jesus. And then at some point you think, well, that love's not there anymore, I'm doubting. It's not doubt about the truth of the matter, it's just a feeling that you lost and you want back. So if you've done any pastoral work with youth, you'll find that occurs. So that means that the imagination can be very powerful in apologetics to move people's emotions and cause people to assess their psychological states. So you can use it in all sorts of ways to encourage a kind of change of desire. So lots of apologists will say this. I just think you have to be clear about where it sits. But you can use all sorts of imaginative arts to produce affections for the right thing and hatred for the wrong thing. After all, that's what films do to you all the time. So think of the Chronicles of Narnia. And by the way, I love the imagination, so you shouldn't see my negativity about the imagination as being sort of a negativity about it all. I named my daughter Lucy after Lucy from the Chronicles of Narnia, and my oldest son's middle name is Caspian. So, and my middle son is Puddleglum. And, not quite, but I couldn't get that past. But C.S. Lewis was very aware of this. So Lewis is powerful not because he wrote Mere Christianity, although he's powerful for that. It's because he also wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. So establishing wonder and love for the truth of the gospel sometimes comes from a strange angle, the imagination. It can have a powerful effect. Furthermore, it can be used by God for good things. Now, this one doesn't involve apologetics, but you can see the power of it. That dream I mentioned that I had when I was in my 20s and living in London, and it was incredibly powerful and directed at my emotions. And my emotions were such that they became converted of some kind. Now, all I can say is that that dream made me feel suffering, which I hadn't felt before. I had kind of a nice cushy background. Okay, I went to boarding school, so I suffered a lot there. I won't go into that. But I wasn't a compassionate person. But after that dream, something happened to me whereby I was caused to feel pain when I saw other people in it. Like it all shot into me in my dream. And then from then on, whenever I saw suffering, and I saw a lot more, I always was brought to a kind of emotional state where I knew that I felt something, I felt compassion. And that, I think, is down to that dream. don't think I felt that way before, but afterwards I did. So the imagination can cause people to change. So you should pursue its use, just never think it replaces making a rational case. And one of the reasons for that is also that a rational case is the only way you can have knowledge. Right? And knowledge is not just I believe. Right? Your faith is not belief without reason. It's belief for a reason. Right? You have a reasonable faith. But a reasonable faith just is another way of saying you know, right? So if you have good reason for it, you believe it, and it's true, then you know it. So if you know that God exists, you're implying that you have a reason to believe that He exists. But if you replace that with kind of experiences or emotion or imagination, you do not have knowledge. You might believe it. You might feel moved to believe it. But you won't reach a state of being rational about your belief, and hence you won't have knowledge. And one of the things you want to be able to say is that you know God exists, that Jesus Christ died for your sin, and that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, and if you repent and believe, you will have eternal life. You want to be able to say those things, not just I believe them and I leapt out in faith, I'm just hoping it's true, but it doesn't matter, it's actually just all about how it makes me feel. That is not going to give anyone knowledge. And so maintaining a rational case is vital for knowledge. But imagination can't give you that. But it can move people. So, for example, the use of the arts, fiction, using imagination to help people to appreciate something. The value of something is often noticed by the imagination. For example, the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, gives an illustration of the atonement, that Aslan dies and then rises again. Now, because of the moving nature of the story, me as a young child, I was moved by that story. But now I'm able to go back and see what Jesus did, and I see the power of it that perhaps I hadn't seen before. So it has a power, it just doesn't have a rational proof. Maybe I'll end with one little story, and then you can ask me what you like. That dream went on, there's a little further story to it, because it's, which I think the Lord did in my life that you can hear about, and the imagination plays a role, but the effects are kind of a little bit more than just I felt a little bit of compassion. About, well, now how long ago, what, 5 years ago? It was before COVID. My wife and I entered a foster care program, and we went through a therapeutic foster care training program. And when you do that, you'll take kids who are hard to place in homes. And so we said, well, sure, we'll do it. And so we took the class. We wanted to adopt for a while, and we were going to try and adopt through the foster care system. So we did it, and we had a little boy called Bryson, who was placed in our home when he was 2 years old. And he was severely disabled. So he has some brain injuries from hydrocephalus. And he was placed in our care as a foster child, and we looked after him, and then we wanted to adopt him. We said, we'll adopt him whenever we can. And, a week before the lockdowns, so we'd probably still be held up in court if this hadn't happened, or exactly that time, we adopted him. So he became our son, and he's now 7 years old. When he was old enough, we enrolled him in a baseball game. He can't speak or move very well. He's got kind of a good left foot, actually, which you want to watch out for. He's wheelchair bound, and he has a walker, so he can use that too. And he has more character than anyone else I know. So I love him dearly, and he's a wonderful son. But we put him in this baseball team, and it was fantastic. One time we were at the baseball game watching him play, and I was up in the stands, and I was about halfway up. And I'm watching a stadium filled with disabled kids playing baseball. And I remembered the dream. And I thought, I'd not connected the two, but I realized that, the Lord had given me compassion. And He also gave me this kind of, I was just sitting there watching kids play baseball. In my dream, everyone was wailing and crying and screaming and just writhing in pain. But this picture was, a confirmation to me of the words that I heard in that dream. I'm not saying it was God, the words were in the dream, but it made an effect on me that I think the Lord brought into my life, which was, it's going to be okay. And this was a picture of things being okay. And I realized, the Lord had done something. Maybe He brought about a dream, and it was just for this reason. But for me, as my own experiences tell me, I was caused to have a kind of compassion I didn't have before. And then all these years later, I had a child who was full of joy, and he is in our home for good. And I was just in this situation that seemed so similar, except smaller. It's just a miracle league game for the disabled kids to play baseball. But I sort of connected the two, and it was a very profound moment. So the imagination can bring about events in people's lives. It's a very powerful thing that we have. I do have all sorts of things to say about what the power it has is also a negative. You can do damage to yourself in the Christian life by using it in poor ways too. I was going to read a bunch from Pascal. Maybe if you want me to, I can give you some of that too. But otherwise, I've waffled on for as long as I possibly can, which is probably beyond the usual scope. Although I was told someone spoke for 2 hours, so I thought I won't hit 2 hours, no way, so I'm okay. I won't do that. But I wondered if you have any thoughts, questions, points, complaints, counter-arguments, whatever you want. Throw it at me and we can talk about it. Yes, ma'am.
So what would you say to somebody who says that using emotions as a way to persuade people of the gospel's truth, as like emotional manipulation? Like,
yes, it would be, because it would be emotional manipulation. And the reason for that is that you're claiming, if someone like that would be claiming that it's a means by which you will come to the truth, right? That's the distinction. The imagination isn't a bad thing to help someone feel a different way about something that they hadn't done before, or to appreciate the value of something they hadn't done before. But it's manipulative as soon as you start to use it to try and get them to think it's true. That's true of propaganda, isn't it? Propaganda plays on your fears to cause you to believe something that is not rationally grounded, right? It's not rational, it's just caused in you by fear. So same would be true of using emotions and the imaginations to try and convince you of something true. You all know what it's like to go to a sermon and to have heard not much said except you feel, right? Powerful rhetoric can be completely devoid of reason. So powerful preachers are all very good at getting people stirred up, but never present a case, are devoid of being able to get truth of the matter. They might be able to move you to do something, to act, or to feel something, but they are incapable of getting you to know anything. And that's the difference. So yes, that's very important. Manipulation is when you use these things to get people to believe something. This isn't about belief. Imagination shouldn't be used that way, nor can it be. When it is used, it's kind of to abuse it. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, excellent.
So it seems to me that there's a distinction we can draw between things that we imagine,
yeah,
right? And I'll grant that those probably don't provide any evidence for any given proposition. But then the distinction between that and the fact that we have an imagination.
Yeah.
Right? And it seems to me that the fact that we have an imagination seems more probably true on theism than it does on naturalism.
Ah, okay.
Similar to how we have the ability for abstract thought, like mathematics. So to go back to imagination, at some point someone thought of the concept of an imaginary number, right, which has no correspondence in reality whatsoever, and yet based on being able to create an entire set of axioms based on imaginary numbers, from which we now have our smartphones, right? And somehow that corresponded to reality, and it just came out of some mathematician's imagination. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on A, that distinction, and B, that counter-argument that, well, imaginary numbers came from the imagination, and yet is actually tied into reality when there's nothing else in reality that they came from.
Yeah, I mean, those sorts of arguments are like explaining cognitive powers, and you can either appeal to sort of naturalism or Platonism or theism, and theism being the best explanation for those sorts of things. I think there's some merit to those sorts of arguments. You basically have to, though, show why it's a better explanation than the alternatives. For example, someone could say, sure, I know, I'm a Platonist, these numbers are abstract objects or something like that. Yeah, you'd have to lay out your case. It doesn't go directly from being able to think of, imagine, to there being a God. You'd have to say, well, it could be theism, or it could be that there are, realms of abstract objects that aren't physical or mental, or it could be that naturalism is true and that they appear to be brain functions or something like that, or explained in the synapses, and you'd have to show why those don't explain the thing. Does that make sense? So,
No, yeah, absolutely.
but yeah, it's a good point. I mean, all of those things are fair game, aren't they, in apologetics, to appeal to God as an explanation for some human capacity, being able to imagine. In my dissertation, it was on language, and my initial thought was being able to think in language or use language is explained by God. But as I worked out, the argument is very difficult to make. But what I found was acquiring a natural language is very difficult to explain without theism. So I did make a case for it, but I had to find a kind of route from, wow, we can make weird noises and people understand what we're saying. That just seems something that needs some explanation. And there's only a couple of options, and I'm going to argue for theism. But I had to find a route from that observation to theism. That's a good point. Yeah, worth looking at. Those are all good fodder for reflecting in that way. So yeah, definitely. And I can't answer about imaginary numbers. There's a good reason I went to all the seminary places and not to the other places. One of those is that I never got really to my times tables. So yeah, they look like imaginary numbers to me. Yeah.
I was going to extend off that. This is negative on evidence towards Christianity. Would you extend that to theism in general, or just
yeah? I don't think you can prove theism with the imagination either. Imagine there's a God. Okay, done. Well, you could suggest like Anselm's argument is somewhat like the imagination, but it's not really. It's not a visual representation of anything. I kind of focused on that. You know, you understand the concept of God. You'll realize that He must exist. I don't know that that's imagination, that's more like conceiving of. So maybe there's a case to be made there. But yeah, I would just say any belief about the actual world. So the scope is about the actual world. You could come up with beliefs about possible worlds, right? Possibly I had a less pointy nose, and now I'm imagining it. Oh, it's such a good world. Just stay there for yeah, my children are always very rude about my pointy nose. Something about being able to take out a small country with it is one point that's been made. But you know, you can imagine a different way the world could have been, and that's a possible way the world could have been. It's not illogical, and so you can gain beliefs about possible worlds, but not about the actual one. And that includes moral beliefs, I'd say, as well, even though those are the sort of candidates people use for developing the immoral imagination and that sort of thing to derive your moral beliefs. Yeah.
How would you describe the imagination if you were going to say it in terms of the difference between like critical thinking skills, hypotheticals, things like that? Because when you're describing some of the examples, it seems as if we're almost going into a realm that resembles critical thinking a lot more, even though I think that imagining things like hypotheticals could be put into that realm and can be used to explain and argue things.
Yeah, and you're right to notice that, and then I'll sort of, the comment I just made now is relevant to that too. When you're imagining a hypothetical, what would be the case or something like that, you can use your imagination there to represent what might be possible. Now, it's unclear to me as to whether you're deriving knowledge from what you've imagined or you're representing what you are considering could be the case, like a hypothetical. Give me an example.
This is the one I used for my senior thesis to explain the concept of prudence. Was like you're jogging down the street and you really want to go grab an ice cream, but you hear a tornado warning. So a prudent decision would be to weigh your options, which is either I can go back home and not get an ice cream, or I can go get an ice cream and possibly get hit by a tornado. The prudent decision is to head back home because the risks outweigh the means.
Yes, okay, so now you've got a whole bunch of imaginary things. You're all doing it right now. You've got that scenario. Some of you are like, I'm just going to the ice cream. Have you seen me run? So, yeah, I mean, that's right, because you're using it to represent possibilities. They're not true of the actual world. They're just possibly true, i.e. logically coherent and therefore possible. And you're using your imagination to construct propositions that are true of that possible world, like there's a tornado and I'm on the way to ice cream and I have to make a decision. Those are all things that possibly true. So you're using the imagination there, and there's definitely a debate over whether the imagination is where you get your beliefs about what's possible, or whether you just are representing what you think is possible. Those are two different things. Like a sentence doesn't give you evidence just a representation of what you're thinking is possible, doesn't give you evidence in addition to knowing that it's possible. And I'm inclined to see the imagination as representative, so I'm inclined just to rule it out. And there are lots of people who agree with me, including Peter van Inwagen, who I feel like taught here at some point anyway. He says, look, if you're going to get the imagination to generate possibilities or hypotheticals like that, you have to also then imagine everything else that would have to be the case. Like, imagine purple cows. Well, now if you believe purple cows are possible, and you've based it on your picture of a purple cow in your mind, you have to imagine all the different things that would have to be true of that world in order for there to be purple cows. A complete rearrangement of the biology of the cow, for example. And if you could do that, sure, but no one's going to do that. So you're better off just thinking, is it logically coherent that cows are purple? And not having to base it on the imagination. And just think, there's nothing illogical about it, therefore it's logically possible. So yeah, using it to represent what's hypothetical or possible is totally legitimate. But do you base your belief on the picture or on what you were representing by the picture, which presumably is a set of beliefs or propositions, right? So yeah, you're into critical thinking. The thing to do for me is to recognize that there's a distinction between the thinking and the representation of thought.
Because I have the rules set up of why prudence was needed, and then it was more just kind of making it digestible to the crowd.
Yes, right. You are giving instructions. This is what fiction authors do. Fiction authors are instructing their reader to imagine something. And if you obey the instructions and can follow them and don't experience the sort of resistance that some people do, then you can be successfully imagined. You were very successful, so you should definitely be an author of fiction, because that worked. I imagined the scenario perfectly. I had no imaginative resistance. So that's exactly what you're doing. And that just is another way of saying, I'm going to represent beliefs in sentences, and I'm going to ask you to represent them in images. And if you do so, you've got another representation of what you're reading. And some of you read fiction, and it's very vivid imagery. And some of you are just happy to follow the story without imagining anything. But those of you who create the images, that you're doing another sort of form of representation or depiction, like a painting depicts an object. So yeah, I would say that's a good use of the imagination. It's just if you ever say, well, I now have the imagination, that's what proves that it's true, that's where I sort of say. Yeah. Good questions. You want to ask? Yes?
I was wondering about, one time I had a dream that had a story to it.
Okay.
So then I went and wrote a story based on the story in the dream with some changes, like who the characters were. So I was wondering, at what point was I imagining? Was that both during the dream, was imagining one story, and then writing the story was imagining a different one, or was it?
Well, you might be doing both there, right? It depends on how well you described your. If you were trying to describe what you imagined as accurately as you remember it, yeah, I suppose the closer you are to the dream, the less you're doing more imagining afterwards. But it doesn't mean your imagination stops, does it? But yes, I mean, dreams are good sources for stories, aren't they not? Especially if you have vivid, crazy dreams. Well, that's got a story. I've often wanted to go back and redream some of my previous ones because they were awesome. So yeah, so writing down your dreams is good fodder for use in fiction in the future. So yeah.
Is my imagination broken if my dreams don't make any sense?
Well, maybe. Not your imagination, maybe the rational part. Like, or maybe it's just you're not going to be a novelist. But that's yeah, I mean, dreams that don't make sense are interesting because presumably at that point the agent performing the actions, the author, is not clearly developing their narrative arc, right? But other times you notice them do so. Have you ever had a dream that is well crafted? Yeah, so you've got potential. It's just practice. practice. So a lot of sleeping.
Take more naps.
And then you'll be fine. Yeah.
Do you see any correlation in imagination and like levels of faith? I don't want to say like levels, but like that aphantasia, would they have a harder time with the like abstraction of God, where they'd have trouble with faith and they'd want more like irrational reasoning instead?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, I don't think that the imagination is key to your increased confidence in the things you think are true. So the reason I think that is consider Paul's argument to the Ephesians. Paul makes a good case for the equal inclusion of Gentiles and Jews into the church. And in his first chapter or so, he says, look, first reason is God predestined this. This isn't an accident. This is not plan B. He decided in advance that Gentiles were going to be part of his people in the church age. So you can't say this is, this isn't what was supposed to happen. It most certainly was. It's his argument, right? Let me show you. He predestined all these things. Therefore, it's not a mistake, or one's not lesser than the other. That was the sort of general idea. And then he says, by the way, also Jesus can put whoever he wants in the church. You know this bit? Jesus is always highly lifted up. It's sort of similar to the Colossians passage where Jesus is of elevated status, i.e. he can put whoever he pleases into his people. And that could be Gentiles and Jews alike. So after he's made his case, though, what's fascinating about Ephesians is 2 times he just pauses to pray. And what he prays is for an increased strength of the inner man. He has this whole phrase about increasing the strength of the inner man. And what he's doing there is he's recognizing something very important about you and I, and that is that we can come to rationally believe something, but unless there's some kind of additional help to give us that strength of confidence, we might just say, well, that's true, but I don't care about it. So the Holy Spirit is being asked or requested by Paul to do a causal work, and that might be to increase the strength of the confidence that they have in the things they know to be true. I never forget when I was running a ministry in Oxford, we had a girl who worked in our team, and she was taking a year out. She didn't have to be I wanted her to be more committed as a Christian, but I wasn't sure she was. Anyway, one of the things that I remember we did was we had a talk on abortion and how to help girls who are really struggling. And one of the wives of one of the team, she ran a pregnancy clinic where they helped girls make good choices. They did ultrasounds, all of that usual sort of thing. And I remember her explaining the abortion techniques, which to me were I just was mortified. I remember being very upset. I mean, once you hear the details of what would happen in the surgery. And I remember her laughing and saying, is that like a vacuum cleaner? And I remember just being, I couldn't believe it. Now, if you'd asked her if abortion was wrong, she would have said yes. She didn't feel anything about it. Nothing in her went further than thinking, yeah, I think it's wrong. But, right, so March for Life is usually of people that think it's wrong, but also love life. Right? They're deeply affectionate towards life itself, of all people, no matter how small, and hate killing. Right? They hate it. Now, the affection part there is often not up to us. Right? I could believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, but God, by his Spirit, can make me love that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I can know that Jesus is coming back, but the Holy Spirit can make me long for Jesus coming back. And I can use my imagination to imagine him coming back. Right? That can increase the affections towards it. So the Spirit does a great deal of work on our affections. In fact, if you think about illumination, the doctrine of illumination, my former teacher, John Feinberg, who I'm often quoting and using, that's what teachers are like when they're really good. You become an advocate for their views. After a while, you think, well, he's right on that too. So he was probably the most influential person in my life. He has this whole chapter in his book on the doctrine of Scripture, which analyzes illumination, and he essentially says it could mean all sorts of things. And of course, the Spirit brings about belief and everything else because God does that. But the doctrine there is really about how you are willing to obey the Lord. Like you want to obey Christ. That's what the Spirit will cause in you, is a desire to do it. So that's not just believing that I ought to do it. That's also thinking I want to do it. There's lots of things that you do that you don't want to do, but you're supposed to do, and you do them anyway. Paying taxes, one day. And right, you do it, and you're asked to, like we're supposed to submit to authorities. The Bible tells us to do. But it doesn't say you have to love it. That's not required. That's okay, right? But Peter says, but freely obey the Lord. Freely obey the Lord as if there's nothing stopping you. The Lord tells you to do something, do it freely. What does he mean there? It's not meaning like you're free to, like I'm going to make it possible for you. No, he's saying you should want to obey the Lord. You should be all about obeying the Lord. You desire to please the Lord, and that becomes your primary function. Now that isn't purely rational. You can know you ought to, but wanting to as well is something that the Spirit brings about in your life, and does so, by the ordinary means of reading the Word and submitting your life to Him. And He brings about these things. But I would say the imagination is often a means by which affections are changed. Sometimes the Lord uses those means too. So yeah, there's kind of two parts, isn't there, to a person? A real rational part, and then there's all this other stuff. And what you have to do when you're with people is you don't neglect one or the other. We're not calculators with no feelings, but we're not just feelers. Like you can't say, I feel like Jesus Christ rose from the dead, therefore it must be true. I imagine that you do. Those just aren't the right categories. You have to be very careful to distinguish. That's basically my point. Right? Is that it's useful in apologetics, but it's not useful for making a rational case. It's really important for all the other stuff, and that there are legitimate ways to use it. You've got to be careful with the power. It's probably the most powerful faculty we have. I mean, it can move people to war, the imagination. By drumming up a fear, you can create a war. Pretty easy, actually. Easier than we'd like it to be. So you have to be really careful with it. But because it's so powerful, if you use it right, it's a really good thing to do. So.
Just based off what you're saying, have you heard about what Aristotle was saying about the vicious and virtuous person?
What was he saying?
Greatly resembles what you were saying. In the sense of when a person believes something, there are 3 different categories that you can use to determine what kind of a person they are in relation to it. So if they know if they do, what was it? Knowing, doing, and liking. So if you know what's good, but you don't do it, you're an incontinent person.
Okay, incontinence, I thought that's what
And then if you do it, you're a continent person, and then if you like doing it, you're a virtuous person, but if you do none of them, you're vicious.
Yeah, well, interesting you say that. I have a whole bunch of stuff on incontinence, which is nothing to do with bladder. My wife always says, you can't keep saying that word. The Greek is akrasia, so acratic, it's an acratic thing where you do what you don't want to do. You're able to do that. And Plato and Aristotle disagree on the matter. Plato seems to think that Socrates is what Aristotle says, disagrees on this, says that you can't ever do something that you didn't desire to do. Whatever you do is just what you want to do. I actually think Plato is more likely to be right on that, but I think Aristotle will be right on beliefs, because I think you can resist a belief even if you know there's good reasons to believe it. And I think that example in the Pharisees is pretty plausible. The Pharisees at one point say, we will kill this man. Why? Well, because he's just raised Lazarus, and if people find out about that, they are all going to believe him. Which to me just is tantamount to saying the case is so good, he's got a slam dunk case for his claim to be the Messiah. But if you say that, you ought to believe it, but they claim you don't. So that would be a case in which someone sees that they ought to believe something because there's good reasons to it, but they refuse to. And that is, of course, not related to the good reason that you've given. As Jesus says, I've given the best reason you can possibly have. Look at all the signs. I just raised someone from the dead. Not believing me in the Messiah now, it's not because I haven't given you good reasons. It's because what? Well, your loves are for your own prestige, they are for your animals rather than the children of Israel, they are for your wealth, they are for your self-righteousness and all of those sorts of things. And that's where your affection lies. It's a problem of hostility towards me because I'm a threat to your power. It's essentially his argument, isn't it? Which is what gets them the boot. They're fired as bad shepherds of Israel. So yes, that's a very good connection to make, and I have all sorts of things to say about that, and a whole other paper I wrote on it, but I won't give you that, because then you'll be here for at least 5 hours. Yeah, you want to follow up?
I do have a follow-up. So you were saying that you can't connect the imagination to rationale, but in the sense, couldn't you then connect it to wanting to do the good, which is just as important?
In what way?
In the sense of, maybe you can't use imagination to rationalize why being kind to everyone is good, but you could imagine that every person you meet is like Jesus, or how big was it, angels in disguise, so automatically you want to be kinder to them.
Okay, yes, because the imagination is good at motivating and causing psychological change, you definitely can use the imagination to motivate good works, right? But you wouldn't be basing a belief that something is true on it, right?
No.
Yes.
Or motivating it.
Yes, and I mean that's an interesting point. You know, could you produce sort of, well, I do it, right? So my son, another story. My son is quite a big part of my life. When people would ask us, why are you doing this? I mean, you're about to sort of surrender a good portion of your life to look after a child who can't look after himself, and you are saying, I'll do it for life, which means for him, he's with us till he'll hopefully outlive me, right? So this is a big commitment. Why would you do such a thing? I always thought, how do I answer that? Until I realized, well, I don't really have a good reason apart from it's a good thing to do, but I do have something about God, and that is he thought it was a good thing for me to do. Jesus heard this little boy's cry, and he looked around and thought, well, who will look after this guy? Because I need someone, and found the Holloways, and the Holloways said, sure, right? So now, when I care for Bryson, particularly when I am lifting him in and out of the bath, which is hard to do, he's 7, I think to myself, Jesus is, I'm his hands, right? I try and imagine myself being Jesus' hands for Bryson. It's Jesus who heard Bryson, it's Jesus who put Bryson with us, and it's Jesus who wants him looked after, and I'm doing the loving acts that Jesus wants me to do for this. I also want to do it. I love looking after my boy, but I also have to use my imagination to remind myself of how this came about. It was Jesus who wanted Bryson cared for. It wasn't just me. And I use my imagination to do that. So it's a really good point. It's highly motivating, especially when the back's a bit tired, and I think, did you eat extra hot dogs tonight, Bryson? Yes, definitely eat bigger. At that point, I have to say, this is what the Lord is wanting me to do. So I imagine Jesus with me as I do it. So really, that's a really good use of imagination. It's very powerful, which is why you should watch it. Okay? You should watch what you do with it. Because imagination can make you proud. Just imagine yourself doing your dream job, and you'll imagine yourself being great. So I said this to a group of people, that some of which want to be pastors. I said, don't imagine yourself in the pulpit preaching. Just don't do it. Instead, find out if you like preaching, and if other people like you preaching, and think that they might be able to listen to you every week, waffle on, like me, and then figure out a way to get good at it. So come to seminary, learn how to do it well, and then go do it, and do it for life. But don't imagine what it will be like to preach, and then base your beliefs about what you're going to do, about how it felt when you imagined it, right? Why? Because they don't justify your belief. And when you get there, and 2 years in, you're highly disappointed because it's nothing like what you thought it would be, you can blame the fact that you spent half your time imagining yourself preaching and thinking, wow, that would be awesome, I would want to do that. Don't do it. Just get up, give it a go, and if you like it, and other people like you doing it, and you can get good at it, that's what you do. So it can be quite dangerous. It can be dangerous for injustice. I'll read you some Pascal. You can have some Pascal to leave you with some warnings about the imagination. Pascal was a mathematician. Yes, right? Pascal was a mathematician. But this book was nothing about math, so that's good. So listen to what he says about people gifted with a lively imagination are much more self-satisfied than the prudent men can reasonably be. They look haughtily at others, arguing boldly and confidently. You see, I'm totally sinful of this, and you've got to watch it. While others are more fearful and diffident, so the former's cheerful look often gives them advantage in the minds of the audience. With such esteem, do they imagine themselves to be wise before the minds of others, that they have the same stamp. They're just the same, but they imagine themselves greater, and this gives them confidence. Of course, imagination cannot turn fools into wise men, but at least it can make them happy and competitive with reason, which can only make them feel wretched. One covers them with glory, the imagination, right? They see themselves as being great, and the other with shame. Reason would produce the opposite view. So they ignore it, they just go with the imagination. And of course, it can bolster popularity. You can run a PR campaign to make people imagine you as something you're not. How do politicians work? They argue what they do. It can bring about injustice, so be very careful. Do you really think this judge, he says, whose venerable age demands the respect of society, is governed purely by noble reason, or that he designs a case on its true merits without any regard to those trivia which affect only the imagination of the feeble-minded. Look at him, as he goes religiously to church to listen to a sermon. This is the point about sermons. Strengthening the purpose of his own reason with the ardour of his charity. There he is, ready to listen as an example to the rest of us. Suppose the preacher appears, though, and it happens that he is afflicted with a hoarse voice, and he looks odd, badly shaved by his barber, and perhaps unwashed. This is a little old. I will bet you that the judge will not keep his solemn demeanour in spite of whatever wonderful truths the preacher may be proclaiming. It's just a point that justice can be affected by the imagination. There's a judge who is not, he's in church, he's supposed to be all prim and proper, and the preacher turns out to be a bit wild. And he then thinks, well, I'm not going to really listen to this person. Why? Because the imagination. I expect everything to look like it's covered in roses. I've mentioned fear and control. Imagination can do that a great deal. And be careful, like he says, suppose the greatest philosopher in the world. It affects philosophers too. Were to find himself on a plank, hanging over a precipice. Do you not think that even though his reason tells him that he is safe, that his imagination will not get the better of him? Sure it will, right? Many cannot even bear the thought without breaking into a cold sweat. The sight of cats or rats or crushing a piece of coal may be enough to unhinge people's reason. Even the tone of voice can affect the wisest or change the mere succession of words into a powerful poem. This is the idea that the imagination is very powerful, so you could be really careful with it. False justify, false release, and a whole bunch of them he writes about. But that is an indication of how powerful it is, and therefore, use it for the good aim, a right aim. Don't try and use it for something it's not designed for. But also, really be careful as to what you use it for in your own life. It's very powerful, and it can send you in the wrong direction very easily. Right? All right, that's unless there's any other questions. Is that a good time to stop before midnight? I turn into a punk. Well, thank you very much. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, I'll pray for you. Can I do that at the end here? Would that be a permissible activity in Ratio Christi? I would love to do that. I've enjoyed spending my evening with you, and hopefully it's been helpful in your ministries amongst the students here, and that perhaps some of you have been helped just to think it through in terms of your own life as well. So let me pray as we finish. Our Father, we're so grateful for the gospel, the good news that Jesus Christ has indeed died for our sin, paying the price that we so deserve to pay. We are those who sin easy. Even the one who we look to as an example, the shepherd, David, who defeated Goliath, who was a man after your own heart, just shockingly sinful. And we know our own hearts too, that we are so prone to wander. We thank you so much for your grace and mercy towards us. We thank you for the hope that we have in the resurrection, a glorified body that will be immune to sin and fit for worship for all eternity. Lord, we long for your coming. Even now we can imagine that great day as it's described in the Bible, when you shall come for your people, when you shall set up your kingdom, an eternal rule of justice, where there will be no more sin, no more tears, no more suffering, where we will be delighting in who you are, fellowshipping with one another and with the triune God. We are so looking forward to that day. Lord, I pray you bless these students here, that you might strengthen their resolve to serve you, but also strengthen their witness amongst the people here. May they have benefited from tonight, but also just all the meetings at Ratio Christi, that they might be equipped to serve you well as they serve others with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And may they see effects occur. May they see others come to know you, to repent, and receive you. Even now, I just pray for those students in this building that are perhaps making merry, enjoying life. Lord, may they be provoked to be arrested in their carefree lives, that they might ask the question, where am I going? What is this life all about? And may there be someone there who might offer this glorious and very simple message of the gospel, and may it have the effect. May you use it to save them, we pray. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, thank you for having me.